So let's talk about Saturn entering Pisces. This is going to happen right after the Pisces Solar Eclipse on the 29th to the 30th of March. And Saturn will remain in Pisces until the 23rd of February 2028. Now, this has both personal effects as well as collective repercussions because Saturn is the lord of karma. He's a slow moving planet when we compare him to Jupiter or Mars, but not as slow as the big collective planets like Neptune or Uranus or Pluto. The thing with Saturn, though, is he's all about systematic change and shifts in structure, particularly structures that seem immovable, things that seem hard to shift and change. And so as he passes through each house, generally he'll constrict, or through each sign, I should say, he'll generally constrict the energy of that sign. And in that constriction stirs up a lot of energy to help us push forward, to help us progress ultimately in the long run. Because if you take it like he's just coming out of Aquarius, and Aquarius is all about rebellion and revolution and all about the people and community. And while Saturn has been in Aquarius, it's almost like he shifts the attention to the polarity of that, to government, to structure, because that's what he rules as well, to things that feel incredibly unjust. And in focusing there, it actually helps build. It helps build collective action. It helps build community. So just know that wherever he goes, he's really like a bulldozer. And it's incredibly constricting and constraining for that particular sign, particularly when he doesn't absolutely love that sign, as is in the case of Pisces, which is ruled traditionally by Jupiter, which is Saturn's opposite. Now, Pisces deals with endings. It deals with religious systems, spiritual cults, as well as jails, prisons, and places where we're confined. It sounds a little bit similar to Saturn. And so when we take Pisces, Pisces is incredibly mystical at like the highest level, but when we get down to like what it's physically about, it's almost about illusion. It's places we can't escape, things we can't get out of. And Saturn is this ruler of institutional structure. So we can assume that when these two come together, we're really talking about, at a collective level, structural change in religious systems, in how we deal with imprisonment, the way in which government interacts with religion and spirituality. We can also assume there is a big change in values that is happening as a part of this, and almost in like the mystical values we all hold. So it feels like there's this big shift collectively, but also individually. Added to that, Pisces is also associated with secrets. This is personal as well as collective, like things that have been hidden from you, things that are sitting in the subconscious, but equally like secrets that you're not a part of, things that you've been left out of, as well as poetry, music, and the arts. It's because Pisces really talks in symbolism. It's this mystical energy. It doesn't speak in words like a book, or like a computer program. It like in numbers, like a computer program. It speaks in like the language of myth, in the language of the soul. And so often it's also a period where we get incredible music, incredible movies, and entertainment. But obviously the key is not to get swept away with the entertainment. Like, we really want to focus on what it is we're shifting and changing. Now, if you have watched the Uranus in Taurus video, I talk about Uranus as being the great awakener. Saturn is also an awakening planet, but it does it in a very different way to Uranus, where Uranus will bring through like events, and it's almost like things coming out of nowhere. Saturn is like this slow, restrictive energy. You can almost think of it like a boa constrictor, slowly wrapping itself around something and starting to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And so sometimes with Saturn, it takes us a little bit to kind of work out where that restriction is. And then all of a sudden we feel uncomfortable and we're like, and often there can be a really big push against that. So something through Saturn's love of restriction, something is being changed within your life over this coming period of time from March through the 23rd of February 2028. You can find that there's something taken away as a part of Saturn's role. He generally gives us, when he's at play in that restrictive energy, it's almost that feeling of like being confined, but also it can show up as the sense of like losing something we thought was ours. Remembering that attachment is the root of all suffering. As soon as we attach ourselves to someone else or to something or to some ideal, we suffer. And so Saturn will often teach us through suffering. Saturn's a difficult planet, but if you want enlightenment, he's the planet. He is the planet that takes us out of our cycle of desire, out of our cycle of attachment, because it hurts so much that in the pain and in that constriction, we kind of have two options, right? We can either battle our way out of it, which is going to be exhausting and we'll probably lose, or we can go within. And really Saturn is always, through that external constriction, is always pushing us within to really understand who we are. And in that way, it is about awakening. So it's this funny thing, like Saturn is this beautiful oxymoron where it's like he constricts us into our liberation. His ultimate aim is moksha, liberation, self-realization, understanding of the self. And I often think of Ramana Maharshi, the famous Indian saint, enlightened being, who said like the only way to God is through suffering. It's a similar line to that. And maybe you know that feeling as well. Like that sense that it's in the pain of a wound, it's in the pain of a breakup or of losing a job or of losing something you wanted, like I said before, that you get forced to look at life in an entirely new way, and you will get forced to come to understand the divine, unspeakable aspect that sits behind that. Now, Saturn is often feared in astrology, and people will talk about things like Saturn returns or Saturn opposition, and there's a lot of fear in that. And I think that often comes, like, yes, there's always a sensationalization that we all do as astrologers, but I think it also comes from misunderstanding Saturn. For me, Saturn is like the Hermit tarot card. For those of you familiar, kind of like this old wise being standing at the top of a hill with a staff in hand, and it's cold around the Hermit. And the Hermit is this energy that it's the journey you have to take by yourself. It's the journey into new frontiers where you're so restricted that it's only you that can walk that path. And it's on walking that path yourself, on letting go of all of these worldly aspirations, desires, possessions, things that keep you trapped, that you'll come into that wisdom, that you will come into that fearlessness, and you will truly realize your own freedom. And so in a way, like this tension between Pisces, and Pisces is generally about spiritual freedom, about mystical freedom, about awakening beyond the borders of physical reality. And Saturn, on the other hand, is like this restriction. And I think these two together are going to bring up some incredible energy, which personally will be very much about you getting yourself free from circumstances that no longer serve you, but equally from the grips of the mind. So before I go back down into like the personal chat, what this will mean for you based on like what signs you might have in your chart or what transits you're going through, I just want to touch upon what's happened previously when Saturn has been in Pisces. Now, the last two times Saturn was in Pisces was 1995 to 1998, and then prior to that, 1966 to 1969. Now, there are a lot of things that were happening during those two periods, but if we go back, knowing that Pisces is about like prisons, is about confinement, is about spirituality, is about religion, is about, it's also about death in a way, or the way death is understood. And Saturn is the Lord of Karma. It's about confinement, about reorganization, about changing systems. These are kind of the big, if we understand that that's the playground we're in with these two, these are the big themes that we see coming up. And I think we're going to see in the next couple of years become really hot topics in culture, become things that maybe you personally have to work with or grapple with through like conversations with friends, or things that you see your government doing, or things that you see popping up in the community. So the first is the rise and decline of cults and extremism. Now, it tends to be, Pisces obviously rules mystical experiences, spirituality, religion to an extent, but we would normally put religion in Sagittarius. And then Saturn comes through, and it's like almost a combo which is about cult-like thinking, because Saturn wants to ground that Piscean mysticism into something tangible. And so generally when Saturn is in Pisces, we hear a lot of news around doomsday type cults or gurus, and kind of like false gurus, I would say. We can find globally that there are different gurus or different teachers who emerge that preach things like the end of the world, or have people follow them, or lead them to their death or suicide, unfortunately. It's also seen as a time where there can also be more hardline or traditional take on existing religions, though I don't feel like that just belongs in Saturn being in Pisces, but I think we'll see a bit of that pop up. And so if we flash back to the last time Saturn was in Pisces, 1995 to 1998, you might have remembered it was definitely core part of my childhood with some of these things. So in Japan, there was the sarin gas Tokyo subway attacks, which were a part of a Japanese cult. There was the Order of the Solar Temple mass suicides in Switzerland, Canada, and France. Heaven Gates mass suicide in Santa Fe, California. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God in Uganda. So it's kind of interesting. There are all these like cult-like groups that pop up to teach us something about power and control within the dynamic of mysticism. And then if we go back to 1966 to 69, we have Charles Manson and the Manson family. We also have Osho. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with Rajneesh or Osho, you might have seen his quotes being bandied around Instagram. It's really important you look at the origin of him, of his teachings, and of the cult that sits behind it. Yes, some of his quotes are incredibly profound, but the energy in which they were born is not really. Then the next point, the kind of like next big theme outside of the rise and decline of cults, we've also got a lot of political scandal that will naturally happen. Again, Pisces in this instance is all about secrets. It's the place we hold the collective unconscious. It's the place where if we tell a friend a secret and we ask them not to tell anyone, we hope it stays there. When Saturn comes through, Saturn is a bit of a sledgehammer, right? I think I might have, no, I didn't. So Saturn is like a bulldozer. He'll kind of come through and he will, if you think of like a building site, he'll run through and bulldoze whatever is there, whatever needs to come up, whatever needs to be moved, whatever needs to be brought to the surface before the foundations can be laid. Now, if there's anything that doesn't need to shift, it won't. But for most of us, there'll be parts of our lives that Saturn needs to bulldoze, to create flat, to make that work, so that he can then build also during this period. Now, as Saturn, so with political scandal, we've kind of got like Pisces ruling secrets and then Saturn ruling government and hierarchies. So these two coming together, we're going to hear the things that have been repressed, the things that we haven't been told, and don't expect it to be what you think it's going to be. We can find this as a time where we understand power imbalances we didn't think were there. We hear about affairs, we hear about information that was previously withheld around people in power. So like a classic example of this was in 1995 to 8, we had the Bill Clinton Monica Lewinsky affair. We also had the Italian Prime Minister at the time being accused of having mafia connections, and the Polish Premier resigning after being accused of being a spy for Moscow. So this is the type of energy we're working with. It's like, what's been hidden? And like I said, it's not your usual suspects when we're talking about Pisces and Saturn. It's kind of like secrets that are a little bit like they've been hidden so well we didn't even know they were there. And you can find that in your own life. Wherever Pisces is in your chart, this is where things come to the surface that need to be seen. The third big theme that comes out with Saturn being in Pisces is we'll often see changes in regulation around death and imprisonment. Pisces rules confinement, like jails and prisons. Saturn, we're dealing with the parts of life that have to do with endings, with death, with things that are being removed. As such, this is a period of time we can find that there's new regulations around imprisonment, like the removal of capital punishment, which has happened the last 2 times Saturn has been in Pisces in different countries. We can also find that there's new regulations that come up around death, like euthanasia, as well as regulation around things that create death, like guns. There is heightened regulation generally during this period. We can find also that this is a period where famous individuals who have wrongly been put under house arrest or jail are released. Like, I'm particularly thinking about the Louis Mangione case in the US. I think it would be really interesting. I'm pretty sure he's going through his Saturn returns as he will go through his trial. And Saturn will be in Pisces. There can also, so just to give you some examples of what's happened the last 2 times Saturn has been in Pisces. 1995 to 1998, South Africa finally abolished capital punishment. The Northern Territory in Australia legalized euthanasia. Australia also had the Port Arthur massacre, for any of those familiar. And that resulted in Australia banning guns. The UK House of Commons voted for the total ban of handguns. And then if we go back even further, 1966 to 69, this is a period of time when the US Supreme Court actually ruled that police have to inform their suspects of their rights, known as the Miranda rights, before questioning them. The UK Parliament abolished capital punishment. There was a lot of US advocacy for improved prison conditions. And in Australia, the last man was hung. So I think if we take that as just some examples of what we could see, I think this is a period where there can be a lot of discussion around capital punishment and should it still exist in the countries who still have it. There'll be a lot of discussion around regulation of guns or other devices that lead to death. And there can also be a lot of advocacy and even improved regulation, I think, around prison conditions, but also around policing. The next thing we see, or like the fourth thing, is the rise in anti-imperialism. Now, that doesn't just have to do with Saturn, but Saturn definitely will hook into it. Previous times that Saturn has been in Pisces, it's almost like this anti-imperialist sentiment gets put into culture through arts, through manifestos, through writing, through singing. It becomes a part of mainstream culture from something else that's going on planetarily, but it's almost like Saturn ingrains it into the psyche, into the collective unconscious. So we have seen that in both previous times that Saturn has been in Pisces. 1995 to 98, the Washington Post and New York Times published the Unabomber Manifesto. There was Osama bin Laden writing his declaration on the jihad of American imperialism. And then we had things like Wales and Scotland actually forming their own parliament and national assembly. 1966 to 69, we're kind of sitting in a lot of anti-war demonstrations. So the Washington March on Washington, we had Martin Luther King make his very important first public address and speech, which has been written into the collective unconscious. And we also had a lot of countries that were still a part of the United Kingdom seek their independence, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean. Next up, the fifth thing, I know it feels like I'm talking a lot about endings and death, but it's kind of like the energy of Pisces and Saturn, is we're going to have that as a big theme in pop culture. There tend to be events during this time that will shape the culture based on death and unexpected shifts like divorce and even assassination attempts. So Saturn in Pisces is quite famous for the assassination of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, the assassination of James Meredith, who was also a civil rights activist, Robert F. Kennedy, and Che Guevara. But that was in the 60s. But in the 90s, we had the death of Diana, which totally shaped a generation. We had the assassination of Tupac and Biggie. We also had the assassination of Gianni Versace. And so you can find, it's not like death doesn't happen at any other time, but you can find that this is a period of time where it seems to be a part of the headlines. It seems as if these things are helping us understand culture, even create movement within culture. And finally, the thing that I found popping up a lot has been discussion around cloning, which is wild because it's not something I would normally put together with Saturn and Pisces. But it's really strange because it's popped up in previous times that Saturn has been in Pisces. So I'm just putting it in here as something to look at, which is, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion around the ethics of experimenting with cloning during this time. And I think governments will get involved in those rules. It's already there. There's been so much talk about like AI, robots. It's not so much that. That's more like Aquarius, Uranus, and Pluto. This is more the idea of like replicating the human body in some way, shape, or shape. And it can mean that there is a lot of discussion that's had around like what's ethical in that regard. Like if we go back to 1995 to 98, we had Dolly the sheep that was cloned. We then had Clinton ban funding on all cloning. We had the first genetically modified 3-parent baby born, and then 19 European nations actually forbid human cloning. Back in the 60s, there was actually frog cloning experiments that were going on, and there was a lot of discussion around the ethics of cloning. It feels like this isn't it? Like it feels like there's been bits of this pop up lately, but I think it will come up as a really big theme. And I'm kind of wondering if this has to do more with Pisces and its capacity to push us beyond the physical, to push us into new worlds, new consciousness, and new realms. And Saturn almost comes through to be like, well, is that ethical? Is that karmically or dharmically right? Okay, let's get back to the personal. So who will this affect most? Like all of us, to be honest. So long as we are bound in a cosmic body, we'll all feel this. But it can be particularly strong if you're in a Saturn transit. So I mean that if you're going through your Saturn returns, and Saturn returns normally is around 27 to kind of 30, depends on the chart, but you'll definitely be in your Saturn returns if you're 28 and a half years old. This is going to be a really big period for you because you're having the first rejoining of Saturn with itself. It hasn't actually rejoined with itself since you were born. This will be a huge period of spiritual awakening for you, and even awakening to the mystical, particularly if you're a little bit skeptical of the woo-woo. You can find that the period of Saturn returns, which lasts for about 2 years, really pushes you into embracing and even seeing the practicality or the truth in that. This will also be really big for those going through their opposition, the Saturn opposition transit, which tends to be most prominent in our 40s. Again, depending. But this is a period of time where there can be a battle between the logical and the intuitive, particularly because we're talking about a natal Saturn sitting in Virgo and a transiting Saturn sitting in Pisces. This is also going to be really big if you have mutable placements. So if you have a lot of planets, not just your sun sign or ascendant or moon, but if you have like a stellium, or you have a cluster of planets sitting in Pisces, Virgo, Gemini, or Sagittarius, it will really shake up the energy of these signs. And I should say, like, Pisces is flexible, it's mutable, it's like water, it just wants to flow. And Saturn is almost like a freezing machine coming through the water. It wants things to be tangible. It wants things that can't be seen to be seen. It's almost like slowing the water down so that it can be seen. So you can find, if you've got Pisces, Virgo, Gemini, Sagittarius placements, there's almost a sense that you're being slowed down. A sense that like you can't run or move as fast as you normally would, or change or adapt as quickly as you should. And it's almost like the universe is wanting you to focus. It's wanting you to work through some karmic energy in these signs. Now, if you want to know how this will affect you, and look up your chart. If you don't do it, Google how to look. If you don't know how to do that, just Google how to look up your chart. I'm using SideReal astrology, so just make sure that chart is SideReal, and look at the house that Pisces is in for you using whole sign. That house will determine where you are experiencing this energy, where there will be change, where there'll be restriction, where there will be spiritual awakening. Because I have to say, even though some of the collective energy I've spoken about, it might feel a bit like a bit kind of heavy, Saturn is heavy, right? But he is, like I said, is this oxymoron. Like, he brings the heaviness to create the lightness. He'll hold the duality of confinement and restriction so that we can find freedom. And my experience of working with Saturn is always, it's like a very fatherly energy. And that's my personal experience. Like, take what resonates for you. And it's almost this energy of like wanting to guide you, wanting to protect you, and wanting to show you the way, but in a fatherly way, which means you're not going to be cuddled and looked after and wrapped in a blanket to do that. It's like the energy of like masculine love, which is like, I will be the wall that will stop you from going the way you're not meant to. I'm going to make sure you go where you need to go, but if you push against me and push against the wall, it's just going to create more havoc, more inattention for you. And so one of the greatest lessons of Saturn is surrender. Like, to work with Saturn is to surrender to reality. It's to surrender to what life is showing you and not fighting it. Generally, when we have Saturn, if we're going through a Saturn transit, or we know that this particular movement is going to be really big for us, the worst thing we can do is run and escape, because Saturn will always find us, but also push against, or use the ego and our will to push against the walls that Saturn creates. It's when we surrender into him, when we allow ourselves to flow, like allow that Saturnian energy to almost provide the space through which we need to flow. We might be heading in this direction at the moment, and Saturn will slowly, like almost build a dam so that you've got no option but to go the way you were always meant to. Finally, if you do find this quite challenging, the best thing we can do is sever. It's one of the greatest ways we can balance planetary energies in our chart. And sever is selfless service. So that means, volunteering at a soup kitchen, donating to charity, but it doesn't have to be money. It can be giving time. It can be helping someone cross the road. It can be picking up rubbish. Whatever it is, it's like doing something which is for the greater good than the ego or the self. I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm wishing you a wonderful time with Saturn in Pisces, and may it bring you the enlightenment that lives within its promise.